The scene that I'm drawing is a building taken from the gardens of Versailles. It's part of a little farming hamlet that Marie Antoinette had built when she was queen, and she'd go there with her friends for their amusement and pretend that they were milkmaids and so forth. It's a charming rustic scene, if perhaps a little romanticised. So how do we draw this? Because in some ways this is a relatively simple subject. It's a small building with not many features at all, but in other ways there's a fair bit of complexity in some of the detail. So what technique, what choices do we make? Well, the drawing you see me drawing at the moment is an example of a drawing technique which I see a lot, but it contains a number of choices which I believe sabotage our desire to capture something, an essence of a scene, and to then present it or represent it in our drawing. For this drawing I'm using a 0.3mm pen, and from start to finish it takes me just under 12 minutes. So when I finish this drawing I'm going to draw it again, but I'm going to make different choices and use different techniques about what I draw and how I draw it, which rather than sabotage my drawing efforts, I believe are going to take my drawing closer to what appeals to me in the scene in the first place, that makes me want to draw it and captures it in my drawing. So I'll just finish this one, just doing the thatching on the roof at the moment, and then when I've got both drawings I'll put them side by side and I'll look at various choices that I've made in each one and different techniques I use to draw in each one, and we'll look at the effect overall they have on our drawing. And here's our first drawing finished. And here I go starting the second drawing. We'll compare the two drawings in a moment side by side, but one of the most obvious choices about this second one is that I choose to take more time. This drawing takes me 1 hour and 10 minutes to draw, which is just over 6 times as long as the 11.5 minutes of the first drawing. So my expectations about what's a reasonable time to spend drawing a subject is important. If I allow more time to draw, that opens up possibilities that don't really exist in a much faster drawing. I'm also using a finer pen in this drawing. This is a 0.2mm pen compared to the 0.3mm pen of the first drawing. Again, a finer pen has both drawbacks and strengths, so we need to work out what's the best trade-off for the scene that I want to draw, for the things that I want to bring out in my drawing. Which pen will create overall the best effect? Some of the different choices I made are pretty obvious, especially in a moment when I draw this entwined rose branching arch that in effect looks like it's over the top of the cottage, creating a suitably romanticized frame for our subject. But other choices might be less obvious exactly what choices I'm making, but I do hope that the overall effect, the way this drawing looks compared to the first drawing, would be more obvious. So I'll just finish this entwined rose archway now, and then we'll compare the two drawings side by side, and I will point out the differences in techniques, the different choices I've made with pen and with line, and highlight the different effect they created in this second drawing, I think, for a much more effective artwork. And possibly some of these decisions in the second drawing might be ones that you might like to adopt yourself. And you might consider that possibly some of the techniques that you're using might just be, unfortunately, sabotaging the very effect you're wanting to create in your drawing. And now I have my second drawing completed. We can compare it not so much with our reference as with the first drawing and see what sort of different choices did I make and what effect overall have they had. So for now, we'll get rid of our reference and have the two drawings side by side. So what observations can I make? First is that in this first one, I actually wasn't trying to draw it quickly, but I made choices not to look at my reference nearly as carefully as I did in drawing this second drawing. And so one of the first choices or techniques we have to consider is how carefully we observe. So for instance, notice here, I've got this wall coming up in a nice neat corner here. But when we look at our reference, this comes up coming out of the wall like a chimney in a way, and then it angles up at 45 degrees, and we can actually see the tree behind above, and the actual corner of the building is here. Now in this drawing, I've done my best to capture that carefully, but I had to stop and look carefully for a few moments. It wasn't obvious. I thought this was just really a shadow line at first glance, and then I realized I could see the trees through. So there's a level of observation that lets us see things that we can then draw. But the opposite is true. If we have a quick look and think we've seen everything that's needed, then we're going to miss out on some of the details that might just make our drawing make sense. This line really serves no purpose, and I have missed out a line as well. I need 1, 2, 3 lines. So I've drawn something that really doesn't make any sense at all. The next most obvious thing to me is an overly heavy line. Regardless of whether it's straight or curved, whether I've drawn it relatively faster, say in here, or more slowly, it creates a line that is very consistent in its weight, its thickness, its color. And all of my lines are very heavy and unbroken. And it is a very different effect in this drawing, partly because I chose to use a finer pen. When I looked at this reference, I was going to use a 0.3, but when I looked at the detail, I thought there's more here than I think I can adequately draw with a 0.3. The close together lines are going to end up joining and looking like black blobs. So I thought a finer line would help me create the detail that I wanted to do, both in the detail of the scene and the detail of the hatching. So sometimes we sabotage our work by simply choosing the wrong pen, choosing a pen that's too thick for what we're going to want to draw, or equally a pen that's too fine and doesn't give our drawing the impact that it needs and would need a heavier pen for. And then with our lines, we can have lines that are all the same, a bit like the outline in a cartoon, which is then colored in, because this is the sort of line work which has traditionally been used in cartoons. A relatively simplified, heavy outline where everything joins up to allow the color to be easily put within the borders. If we look at my line work here, we see along the top of the roof, we do not have a straight line. And we do not have an unbroken line. We have a combination of lines, some straight, some a bit rounded, and a few dots. And these don't always even line up end to end exactly, because I'm trying to create the effect of this very rough line made of thatch. And simply drawing a line does not capture the effect of this edge. So choosing to go slower with our line work and not seeing this as an edge or an outline, but to see everything I put on the paper as creating an effect that I'm trying to capture from my reference is an important thing. Drawing outlines will often end up sabotaging the impact of our drawing. Linked to this is that this scene looks very black and white. There are no shades of grey, and yet this is a scene where there are shades of grey. If I were to desaturate the colour, there'd be a full range of values, of tonal values, from white to lighter grey through to darker grey through to almost black. And if I want to capture the feel of this scene, then I'm limiting myself. I'm certainly sabotaging my efforts if I don't allow myself any tonal value in my technique. While the relatively fine pen I was using in this drawing did make creating darker values a bit of a challenge and quite time consuming, because many more lines close together are needed to create a darker effect, it was important to create the effect from the scene I wanted to capture in this drawing. The fourth way I think we can sabotage our drawing efforts is when we oversimplify our scene. So these windows don't capture the very small panes of glass that make up each of these panes of glass. This one also doesn't capture the fact that we can see right through this cottage, that it's basically one big room at least here, and we can see the center of a window that's on the other side. And so we lose the chance to create a sense of three dimensions, of actually looking right through, completely through this building, because we've oversimplified the design of the window and the way we've added the tone. We've just blocked it all in so that they both look the same. Perhaps the most obvious way that I've simplified this is that I've left out this. I've taken the very, very common drawing approach and said, oh, that looks really hard, I'm not going to do that. And while I've never really had a problem with trees or foliage, when I first began to draw street scenes, I would leave out the people and I would leave out the cars because in my mind, they were too hard. So I would simplify my scene, but in so doing, I would sabotage the overall visual effect of a streetscape. Because let's face it, a streetscape with no people and no cars does not really look so much like a street. These trees behind the cottage are actually representing quite a lot of detail, and yet I've oversimplified them to just an outline basically. They could be cut out of green paper and stuck behind the house. So there is no sense of depth, of difference, of this being in front of that. My other simplification is that I've done away with shadows. And again, shadows are fundamental in creating a sense of three dimensions, but they also create a sense of reality. And if we look at a scene without shadows, it may not be obvious that there's no shadows there. There may be some of you watching this where before I pointed out that there were no shadows, you hadn't noticed, but now that I've said it, it's pretty obvious. Well, shadows create a strong sense of reality. It's not so much that we notice them when we're there, but when they're not there, there's something not quite right about our scene. And so we can see here that in adding the smaller panes, in representing, if you like, the interior of the building through what we see through to the other side, created a stronger sense of three dimensions. That these shadows tell us that this overhangs, and that's why it casts a shadow. Tells us that this sits back and the sun's slightly behind it, which is why it has a shadow cast on it. Whereas here, we really have no idea whether this is very far back from this corner or not. And this detail here has been simplified to the point where it may not be obvious to everyone what's even happening here. Another technique that's often used in drawings, which I think really does sabotage our drawing efforts, is to use pattern instead of creating effect. And I see it most commonly in drawings in foliage, and I deliberately employed it here for this hedge. It's usually combined with an outline, which is very much a stylized outline. And then we have some sort of fill that looks something more like this than anything else. And sometimes it's heavier in one spot to represent darker value. Possibly there's shadow in there. But particularly if it's over a long area, it often becomes less intense and more hastily done in the later part that's drawn. And it's not as if this in any real way looks like what we're seeing here. It's become a pattern or a symbol that in our mind represents this. And in most drawings, this is going to sabotage the overall effect. Whereas my line work here is trying to capture the effect of what we see here. And I've done it in two ways. I've got these small shadowed areas that I've hatched into place. And I've also used hatching over the entire hedge to represent not shade or shadow, but the colour, to create a tonal effect so that my scene's not black and white, but this represents therefore a different tonal value to the wall of the house, all because of the hatching that I've done. Another place where we see a pattern here is in the thatched roof. It's made of reeds all bundled together in the one direction tightly and then stacked on each other and trimmed into place. However, I haven't in this first drawing actually observed the edge very well. I've still just drawn it as a straight line. Even though if I look at this line, it actually looks more like this, because these are bundles of thatch that are put together. And while they're trimmed in a straight line, their thickness is not even. And it's capturing characteristics such as this that help create the sense of this is actually made of bundles of thatch. The other thing is that even though I know these are long reeds, this is not how they look. We don't have single long reeds coming down the whole length of the building. In fact, we have bundles, and in some parts you can see very short lengths of what is obviously a reed, but this is disrupted by lots of moss that's growing on the roof as well. But what's stronger is we can see these horizontal lines. Sometimes it's where the roof changes direction, but it's also where the stitching has been put in place to stitch the thatch to each other and to the roof. And so I've chosen to represent those lines first and then try to create the feel of the way some of the shadows are formed from this construction. I've also tried to represent that down here we actually don't have a straight hard edge as if it's a bit of 4x2 timber or something. But this is actually a rounded curve of bundled thatch. So I've tried to create a sense of rounded curve. This sort of oversimplification can come from a lack of observation. It is very easy to underestimate the amount of looking we really have to do with a subject to see all the things we need to see to draw it well. We look at something, we think we've seen it, and then we draw what we think we've seen. Another way we sabotage our drawing is not making an effort to create a sense of depth. Now, in some drawings, I would have actually drawn this rose archway with a heavier pen, with a 0.3, because a heavier look makes something look closer, and a lighter look, a lighter line, a lighter touch, lighter tonal values make something look a bit further away. But I didn't want to risk this firstly looking heavy and lumpy when it is still quite an elegant structure, and I didn't want it to totally overpower the line work in the house, which in the end is fairly delicate line work for me, for the sorts of scenes and drawings I usually do. But you'll see how I've drawn the trees in the distance, trying to add just enough detail to make them look real, but with a very light touch so that they sit behind the house. And then, and I could have even done this a bit more, we can just, in parts where helpful, give a heavier line to parts of our drawing just to help them look closer. Another thing that I've done here, which I didn't do in the first drawing at all, is that I made minor manipulations to the scene to improve the effect of my drawing. Most noticeably here, where this darker tree that ends up going behind the chimney, I've exaggerated its size and I've increased its darkness. And I did that because it makes the chimney really stand out more to have the darker values behind it. With this bower, I actually lowered it slightly because I felt sitting a little bit closer was just a nicer framing, because in a sense I was balancing this with this, creating a frame in effect for our cottage. And I also considerably simplified this. At a glance it may not look it, but I certainly did not follow this with any exactness. Here's another example of not observing carefully. This railing here, as you can see, I've drawn it as if this whole railing is at 180 degrees to us, and all of these rail supports are the same distance apart, whereas in fact this rail actually curves around towards us, which means the foreshortening would require that these rails become closer and closer together as it curves towards us, which I have done in this drawing. I've also left the rail off the other side of the stairway completely. And of course I've overly simplified the hedge here, and we've lost the sense that this is 3 dimensions and that it curves around inside the steps. Well, what are the ways we've looked at can sabotage our drawing? The first is we simply don't observe our subject carefully enough to see the details that we need to see to be able to draw them. The second was that we can draw overly simple, heavy lines, where really we're drawing outlines rather than trying to create the effect of that subject in the setting that it's in. We don't consider drawing some lines more heavily and some lines more delicately, even broken lines, than others. Line simply becomes a way of outlining to contain a subject rather than a tool to use to create an effect. We can convert our scene basically into black and white and lose all the subtlety that shades of grey give us. We can oversimplify things, so we leave out detail that would be difficult to draw, not because we haven't seen it, but possibly because we don't want to risk it. We think if we don't do it right, it will ruin our drawing, or sometimes because we just can't be bothered to spend that long on our drawing. And sometimes in response to that, instead of drawing the detail, we draw patterns, which in our mind represents in some symbolic way that substance. And because we're drawing with heavy outlines that all look the same, with oversimplified heavy edging, with minimal shades of tonal value, we end up creating scenes that look very flat, that have no depth. And we add the oversimplification to that, and they can end up looking very cartoon-like, which is great if we're trying to draw cartoons. But if we're trying to create a more realistic effect, then by more careful observation, by not drawing lines as outlines to contain shape, but seeing lines as ways to create a visual effect that represents something in our reference, by using hatching to create tonal values that make some things come forward, some things sit back, give 3 dimensions to other things, and by not drawing patterns, but to make marks that actually create the effect of the detail, we can actually create something that does relate directly to what we're looking at. And by a combination of all these things, and by manipulating the detail that we draw and the tonal values that we use, we can make some things come forward closer in our drawing and other things sit back. Well, what did you think? I hope that I've encouraged you in some way to rethink some of the approaches, some of the strategies, some of the techniques in your drawing that may help your drawing end up closer to where you'd like it to be. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. I hope you found this interesting and helpful, and I'll post this reference on my channel community page, so if you want to have a go drawing this building from Marie Antoinette's Dairy Hamlet, you can. But whatever you're drawing and however you're drawing it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.